Everyone in the room laughed when a Chinese millionaire mocked a black waiter. They thought it was just another cruel joke, but what happened next left the entire restaurant in stunned silence. This is the story of how one man's reply changed everything. The evening was grand, the kind of night where the wealthy gathered under glittering chandeliers to celebrate themselves. The restaurant, nestled in the heart of New York, was not just any dining hall. It was the kind of place that whispered wealth in every detail, the polished marble floors that reflected the light like glass, the velvet curtains that fell in rich folds, and the chandeliers dripping crystal that bathed the room in a golden glow. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, balancing trays of fine wine and delicate plates that looked more like works of art than food. Soft music from a live string quartet floated in the background, a melody so gentle it seemed to weave into the laughter and chatter of the guests. Inside this dazzling setting, crystal glasses clinked with every toast. The laughter was sharp and confident, rising above the hum of conversation. At the center of it all sat Mr. Zhang, a Chinese millionaire who enjoyed the spotlight as though it were his birthright. He was a man of influence, his fortune built on shrewd deals and clever investments, but what people remembered most about him wasn't his money, it was his arrogance. Zhang thrived on being admired. He enjoyed the way conversations shifted whenever he spoke, how people leaned closer, hanging onto every word. And most of all, he relished the laughter that followed his jokes, whether they were witty or cruel. This evening was no exception. Surrounded by business partners, friends, and admirers, Zhang sat at the grandest table in the room. His tailored suit gleamed under the chandelier's light, his gold watch flashed with every movement of his hand, and his booming voice carried effortlessly across the room. Each word, each gesture, was delivered with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. And the people around him encouraged it, nodding, laughing, feeding his pride like fuel to a flame. But while Zhang basked in the admiration of his circle, someone else moved quietly in the background. Among the waiters weaving through the tables was David, a young black man whose presence, to most of the guests, hardly registered. To them, he was simply there to refill glasses, clear plates, and vanish silently when no longer needed. Yet David was far more than what they saw. He had come to China with dreams of building a life, of finding opportunities that had seemed scarce back home. His path had not been easy. He had faced challenges that tested his strength, words that cut deeper than blades, and moments where giving up might have seemed easier than pressing forward. But David had something many of the wealthy in that room did not: resilience. He carried himself with quiet dignity, a steadiness that no insult could easily shake. His eyes were sharp, observant, taking in every detail, though he spoke little. To the wealthy guests, David's uniform made him invisible. But behind the black vest and white shirt stood a man who knew his worth. Every careful step he took, every glass he refilled, every polite smile he offered, it wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It was pride in doing his job well, no matter who watched. And though the chandeliers shone on men like Zhang, it would soon be David, the quiet waiter, who would command the room in a way no amount of money ever could. As David leaned forward to pour wine at Mr. Zhang's table, the millionaire's smirk widened. His lips curled upward in a way that carried no warmth, only arrogance. He glanced at the faces around him, ensuring he had an audience, and then, with deliberate precision, he spoke. His voice was loud enough to carry across the table, sharp enough to cut through the gentle notes of the string quartet. In Chinese, he cracked a cruel joke about David's skin color, twisting it into a punchline that mocked his very presence in such an elegant place. The reaction was immediate. Laughter erupted, loud and unrestrained, bouncing off the polished marble walls. Expensive jewelry shook as women leaned forward in their glittering gowns, clutching their pearls not from shock, but from the force of their amusement. The men laughed even harder, slapping the table, their gold watches flashing as they raised their glasses in mock toasts. The sound was thunderous, a chorus of ridicule that seemed to engulf the room. Everyone laughed, everyone except David. He stood still, holding the wine bottle with careful hands. His posture remained professional, his face unreadable, but inside, he could feel the sting. Every chuckle, every cruel smile seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. Time slowed for him, as if the laughter dragged on far longer than it truly did. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the raw ache of humiliation. Zhang leaned back in his chair, basking in the reaction he had created. He thrived on this, the way people laughed at his words, the way their eyes sparkled with admiration for his supposed wit. To him, the waiter was not a man, not someone with a story or dignity, but merely a tool for entertainment. Zhang lifted his glass slowly, savoring the power he felt in that moment, then lowered his voice just enough to sound intimate, though still clear enough for those close by to hear. In Chinese, he whispered with a smirk, "What could someone like him possibly know about culture? He's just here to serve us." The words dripped with contempt, as if David's entire existence could be reduced to carrying plates and pouring drinks. His friends leaned closer, nodding eagerly, chuckling softly in agreement. Their laughter wasn't as loud this time, but it carried the same cruelty, a private sneer meant to reinforce their sense of superiority. Each nod, each smirk was a spark, fueling Zhang's arrogance even further. Together, they created a cruel performance, one that reduced another human being to nothing more than the butt of a joke. David's hands tightened ever so slightly around the bottle, though his movements remained smooth, controlled. Outwardly, he showed no sign of anger, no hint of the storm brewing inside him. Years of discipline had taught him restraint, and so he stood tall, silent, steady. But his eyes, if anyone had bothered to look closely, held something different now. There was no shame in them, no fear. There was fire, hidden but alive, waiting for the right moment. Around the table, a few guests laughed half-heartedly, but some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Not everyone found the display amusing. A woman at the far end glanced at David, her smile fading as guilt pricked at her conscience. Another man looked away, suddenly fascinated by the contents of his glass, unwilling to meet the waiter's eyes. Still, none of them spoke. Zhang's presence was too commanding, his wealth too intimidating. It was easier to laugh along, or at least pretend to, than to challenge him. The music from the quartet continued to play, delicate and elegant, but it clashed horribly with the harshness of the laughter. The contrast made the cruelty stand out even more, as if the beauty of the setting only magnified the ugliness of the moment. And in that moment, David realized something. This was not simply about him. This was about every person who had ever been mocked, belittled, or underestimated because of the color of their skin, the job they worked, or the place they came from. The insult hurt, yes, but it also lit a fire in his chest. A determination not to remain invisible, not to allow this arrogance to go unchallenged. For Zhang, it was just another joke, another moment to bask in attention. For David, it was the beginning of something far greater, a turning point where silence would no longer be enough. David stood still, holding the wine bottle with steady hands. To the crowd, he looked calm, almost indifferent, as though the mockery had slid off him without leaving a mark. But inside, a storm was brewing. His chest tightened, his pulse quickened, and his thoughts sharpened like a blade. Every word Zhang had spoken had reached him clearly. Not a single insult was lost in translation. For years, David had studied Chinese, not casually, not in passing, but with discipline and hunger. Long nights bent over books, endless hours repeating tones until his voice aligned with precision, conversations practiced in markets and on crowded buses until the language flowed naturally from his tongue. It was a skill few expected from him, and that was his advantage. He carried it quietly, like a hidden weapon, waiting for the right moment. And now, here it was. This was not the first time he had been mocked, nor would it be the last. Life had taught him to endure insults, to smile when others laughed at him, to stay composed when people tried to strip him of dignity. He had endured because he knew his worth was not determined by the ignorant. But this time, something inside him shifted. As he stood under the golden glow of the chandeliers, the laughter around him no longer felt like background noise. It felt like a challenge, a test. Zhang's arrogance had crossed a line, turning David into a spectacle for the wealthy to sneer at. Yet David knew something Zhang did not. He was not powerless. He was not voiceless. And he would not remain silent. He steadied his breath. His grip on the wine bottle loosened as resolve filled his body. He looked at Zhang. Not as a servant gazing at a master, but as a man looking at another man, equal in every way that truly mattered. In that silent exchange of eyes, David decided. He would reply. He would not just defend himself, but he would do so in the very language Zhang believed he could never command. He would turn the mockery into silence, and the laughter into awe. The storm inside him was no longer contained. It was ready to break. Placing the wine bottle gently back on the table, David straightened his posture. For a brief moment, the laughter still echoed around him, bouncing from one wealthy guest to another, but he no longer heard it as ridicule. He heard it as background noise, fading, hollow, meaningless. Slowly, he lifted his eyes and fixed them directly on Mr. Zhang. His gaze was not confrontational, not hostile, but firm. Calm. Steady. And then he did something none of them expected. David opened his mouth, and in flawless Mandarin, his voice rang out, low but clear. "Sir, your words make me feel sad. Serving others is not shameful. True class is shown by respecting people." The words, simple yet powerful, landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread instantly. The room, which only seconds earlier had been alive with roaring laughter, froze. Forks halted halfway to lips. Knives rested awkwardly in midair. Glasses trembled in the hands of men who moments before had raised them proudly. The silence was so sudden, so sharp, it was almost deafening. All eyes turned to David. The waiter they had mocked, the man they thought invisible, now stood tall in his simple black and white uniform, speaking their own language more elegantly than many of them could themselves. His tones were perfect, his phrasing respectful yet cutting, his presence undeniable. Gasps rippled through the table. A woman's jeweled hand flew to her mouth. Another guest blinked rapidly, unsure if they had heard correctly. The musicians in the corner faltered for just a moment, their bows dragging hesitantly across strings as they too registered the sudden shift in the air. And then, complete stillness. David's words hung in the golden light of the chandeliers, heavy with truth. He had not raised his voice, he had not insulted in return, yet the weight of what he said pressed down on every person at that table. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man they had dismissed as ignorant, incapable, just a servant, had revealed himself to be far more cultured, far more disciplined, far more dignified than the millionaire who mocked him. Mr. Zhang's smirk vanished. His eyes widened ever so slightly, the color draining from his face. For once, he had no clever comeback, no arrogant laughter to hide behind. The room that always applauded him now stared in uneasy silence. The power he fed on had slipped through his fingers, and the attention he craved now turned against him. David, meanwhile, did not gloat. He did not smile, did not seek to humiliate. He simply stood, shoulders squared, his dignity shining brighter than the chandeliers overhead. He had said what needed to be said, nothing more, nothing less. In that moment, the roles had reversed. The millionaire, draped in wealth and arrogance, appeared small. And the waiter, dressed in plain clothes, commanded the room with nothing but truth and respect. The silence lingered, heavy, unbroken. And in that silence, everyone in the room realized something they would never forget: true class is not measured by money, but by how one treats others. Mr. Zhang's face flushed a deep crimson, the color creeping up his neck like fire. His smirk had vanished, his lips parting slightly as if to form a retort, yet no words came. The man who had always relished in dominating every conversation, the millionaire whose arrogance filled rooms larger than this one, now sat frozen, his tongue tied. The silence pressed down on him harder than any insult ever could. He darted his eyes across the table, searching desperately for the validation he was used to, for the chuckles and nods that usually followed his words like loyal servants. But tonight, they were gone. His companions, those who had moments earlier laughed so loudly at David's expense, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few stared down at their plates, their forks suddenly fascinating. Others avoided Zhang's eyes completely, afraid that supporting him now would reveal their own pettiness. The glittering jewels and tailored suits did little to hide their shame. And then it happened, soft, hesitant, but undeniable. From the far end of the table, a guest began to clap. Just once, twice, before stopping, as though testing whether it was acceptable. The sound broke the tension like a crack in ice. Another pair of hands joined in. Then another. A ripple of applause moved cautiously across the table, not loud, not boastful, but sincere. It was not for Zhang. It was for David. The guests weren't just clapping for the flawless Mandarin or the elegance of the words. They were clapping because they recognized something rare, something that wealth alone could not buy: courage, dignity, and the quiet power of a man who refused to be diminished. David did not bask in it. He did not bow grandly or smile triumphantly. His response was humble, graceful. He lowered his head slightly in a respectful bow, the kind that carried centuries of meaning in Chinese culture, then turned away. With calm steps, he picked up his tray and continued his duties as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everything had changed. Now, no one in that room saw him as just a waiter. His simple black and white uniform no longer defined him. Instead, they saw intelligence in the way he carried himself, confidence in his voice, and strength in his composure. He had taken an insult meant to break him and transformed it into a lesson they would all remember. Mr. Zhang sat stiffly, his pride bruised, his usual armor of arrogance shattered. For once, the spotlight was no longer his to command. The attention had shifted, not because of wealth or status, but because of truth spoken with grace. The chandeliers still glittered, the wine still sparkled in crystal glasses, the music played on, but the atmosphere had shifted permanently. The guests ate more quietly now, humbled, their laughter subdued. Somewhere deep inside, many of them realized they had witnessed something more valuable than all the riches on display, the undeniable strength of human dignity. And David, without fanfare, walked on. The mood of the evening had shifted completely. Where moments earlier the air was thick with arrogant laughter, now it felt heavy with reflection. The once boisterous chatter dimmed into murmurs, the clinking of glasses softened, and even the music seemed to slow, as though the very atmosphere had bowed to the weight of what had happened. What began as a display of wealth and mockery had transformed into a quiet lesson in humility. Guests who had laughed the loudest now sat uncomfortably in their seats, their smiles faded, their eyes lowered. Some whispered apologies under their breath, not to David directly, but to themselves, as if ashamed of having joined the cruelty so blindly. The shame stung sharper than they expected, because deep down, they knew they had betrayed their better selves. Later in the evening, as the dinner drew to a close, a few of the guests approached David one by one. Their voices were softer now, stripped of arrogance and dripping with sincerity. One woman, still adorned in diamonds that sparkled under the chandelier, leaned toward him and said quietly, "I am sorry. You reminded us tonight that true class has nothing to do with money or power, it is shown in how we treat people." Another man, usually proud and loud, admitted, "We laughed because it was easy. But you showed us that respect cannot be bought. It comes only from character." Each word they spoke was more than an apology, it was an acknowledgement that David had shifted their perspective, if only for a night. He had turned the laughter that mocked him into silence, and then into admiration. Without shouting, without anger, without cruelty, he had revealed the hollowness of arrogance and the strength of dignity. When the evening finally ended and the last of the guests filed out into the glittering streets of New York, David gathered his things and stepped into the cool night air. He walked home not with bitterness in his heart, but with pride. The city lights shimmered on the pavement, and though he carried no riches in his pocket, he carried something far greater within himself, self-respect, unshaken and unbroken. As he moved through the quiet streets, his thoughts were calm. He did not dwell on Zhang's insult, nor on the laughter of the guests. What stayed with him was the silence that followed his words, the silence of realization. He had defended himself not with rage, but with wisdom. He had shown, both to them and to himself, that true dignity is not loud or vengeful. It lies in restraint, in courage, and in the refusal to let another's cruelty define who you are. That night, David proved something timeless: wealth fades, power shifts, but respect, earned through character, endures forever. As for Mr. Zhang, he avoided David for the rest of the evening. The man who had always basked in the sound of laughter, who thrived on mocking others to feed his own pride, found himself suddenly starved of the attention he once commanded so effortlessly. The guests who normally echoed his arrogance with applause and smiles now shifted away from him. Some refused to meet his eyes. Others whispered in corners, not with admiration, but with unease. For the first time in years, Zhang had no audience. His wealth could not buy back the laughter that had died, nor could his arrogance rebuild the authority he had lost in a single moment. He sat quietly, stirring his untouched glass of wine, his face still tinged red, his hands restless. He had been humbled, not by someone richer or more powerful, but by a quiet truth spoken in his own language, by a man he had dismissed as insignificant. The humiliation was not loud or dramatic, it was subtle, yet far more piercing. Because David had not shouted, he had not insulted, he had not mocked. Instead, he had spoken with dignity, and it was that very grace that made the wound deeper. Arrogance can fight arrogance, but it cannot withstand humility. And Zhang, for all his millions, had no defense against the truth David had laid bare. As the night wore on, the atmosphere never quite returned to its earlier grandeur. The chandeliers still sparkled, the musicians still played, but something had shifted permanently. A story had been written in that room, a story that would outlive the glitter of that single evening. And indeed, the story did not remain within those gilded walls. The tale of what happened spread, first among the guests who had witnessed it, then through whispered conversations in social circles, until it began to take on a life of its own. People spoke of the black waiter who, with flawless Mandarin and unshakable composure, silenced a millionaire and turned mockery into shame. They spoke of the lesson carried in his words, that respect is not a luxury item, not a privilege reserved for the wealthy, but the foundation of true human worth. David himself never boasted of it. He did not need to. He walked home that night the same way he always did, with quiet steps and a steady heart. But within him, he carried something greater than applause or recognition. He carried the knowledge that he had stood firm, that he had not allowed cruelty to define him. He had shown restraint, wisdom, and courage, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone watching that character is the greatest wealth of all. And so, the story became more than just an incident in a restaurant. It became a lesson retold, a reminder passed on. Because sometimes, the person who is laughed at today is the very person who, with dignity and grace, will teach us tomorrow that respect is the truest form of greatness.